Thomas thought he could get away with bullying and theft until a guide dog taught him a serious lesson. His life changed. Thomas Rivera grew up in a decent neighborhood at the outskirts of a mid-sized business town. He was the youngest of three kids. He was raised by using a single mom who worked double shifts at a nearby production plant. His father had left when Thomas was 3. Thomas didn't remember much of his family. He grew up on the back of a burden of anger and abandonment. Home was an unstable emotional environment. His mother, exhausted from paintings and wrestling with her very own unresolved trauma, would shuffle between moments of distant coldness and unexpected severe bursts of frustration. His older brothers, each suffering with their personal sense of worth, frequently took out their frustrations on him. Soon Thomas became defensive. Thomas quickly learned that aggression will be a shape of safety. Feeling continuously ignored and powerless at home, he discovered that creating fear in others provided a sense of control he had never experienced elsewhere. His discovery of this power became refreshing. His initial bullying started relatively small. He could say impolite and mean things, make rude remarks, and employ strategic social exclusions. He was also able to perceive the weak and smooth praise. He would then rent the use of diffused mental manipulations to torture them. At middle school, Thomas had developed a reputation. Everyone hated and feared him. It was deemed unfortunate to be the object of Thomas's ridicule. He wasn't just physically intimidating, but cunning. He understood precisely how to identify and exploit vulnerabilities in his peers, making his targets feel uniquely helpless. As Thomas entered high school, his bullying became worse and calculated. He wasn't just acting out of raw anger, but with a cold, strategic intelligence that made him particularly dangerous. He would study his prey before attacking them. In the freshman year, he began targeting students who seemed vulnerable. Students like Alex Rodriguez, a quiet immigrant scholar who struggled with English. Thomas could knock Alex's books from his hands in the hallways, mimicking his accent. He was so good at it that it made people laugh. Since people loved the entertainment, he got bolder. One day between second and third period, Alex was wearing slightly worn clothes. He was retrieving books from his locker. Thomas approached with calculated casualness. "Hey, Rodriguez," Thomas called out, using Alex's last name as a generic insult. "Nice shirt." Alex glanced down nervously. His faded plaid button-up was indeed showing signs of wear. Thomas stepped closer, his voice low enough for only nearby students to hear. "Did your mom buy that at a discount store? Or maybe from the donation bin?" A few students, Thomas's gang, snickered. Alex's cheeks reddened. "Leave me alone," Alex mumbled, trying to close his locker. Thomas blocked the locker with his arm. "What was that?" "Couldn't hear you." "I said, leave me alone," Alex repeated with his accent, voice slightly louder but trembling. Thomas mimicked him accurately. Then he leaned in, his breath close to Alex's ear. "You know what's funny? Everyone knows how broke your family is. How your dad lost his job last year? Must be hard knowing your family can barely afford lunch." The surrounding students were now fully watching. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed eager for the confrontation. "Stop," Alex whispered, eyes starting to well up. Thomas was unfazed, and each word was a calculated knife. "Stop what? Telling the truth? Everyone here knows your situation. Poor kid, scholarship student, one wrong move and you're out." Alex grabbed his books and tried to push past Thomas, but Thomas deliberately stepped to block him each time, a predatory dance of control and humiliation. "Where are you going so fast?" Thomas said, loud enough for others to hear. "Afraid someone might hear about how your family's doing?" "Thomas, please, just let me go." "Oh, so now you can beg. You're not so tough now, huh?" "Thomas, I think we should leave him," Gregory, one of Thomas's friends, said. He spotted a teacher walking across the hall. "I can do whatever I want, Gregory. Can I have a little chat with little old Alex?" He grabbed Alex, who started crying immediately. This drew the teacher's attention. He called Thomas into the principal's office. "I want your mother here tomorrow," the principal said, but Thomas told them she wouldn't be available. "I need a guardian or someone who can represent you. We need to talk to someone." Thomas nodded and was given detention. At home, his mother's increasing exhaustion and emotional distance provided no moral counterweight. She was often too tired to engage with his behavior, and his brothers, who had their own histories of aggression, tacitly approved of his growing reputation. "I heard you were called to the principal's office today," one of his brothers mocked. "Yeah, it's nothing. "I didn't do anything." "I bet," they mocked again. "Just try not to get expelled, Thomas. I can't handle this." His mother was frustrated. No one really cared about what he does. Thomas soon became bold enough to expand the locale of his bullying experiments. The local mall became another hunting ground. Here, away from school structures, Thomas would target younger teens, using intimidation to extract small favors, having them buy him food, forcing them to run errands, demanding they share their money. Thomas was a big boy. He physically had the body to make his peers tremble. His methods went beyond physical intimidation. Thomas was skilled at social engineering. He was a genius at spreading rumors, manipulating social media, creating elaborate scenarios that isolated his targets. He'd identify a student's insecurity and then craft elaborate narratives that would systematically destroy their social standing. Thomas was a perfect bully. As Thomas entered his junior year, his petty thefts became more calculated. He started targeting specific locations like convenience stores, small shops where teenage cashiers would be less likely to challenge him. His technique was methodical. He'd observe routines, identify moments of vulnerability, and strike with precision. His first serious theft occurred at a local electronics store. He had walked into the store with the intention of purchasing something. He bored them with questions so that they were eager to attend to any other person. He would ensure that he was safe of any eye before picking something. When another staff comes to attend to him, he would repeat the same technique. He was good. With a combination of distraction and quick hands, he managed to steal several and high-end smartphones. He sold them to a network of older teenagers who ran a black market for stolen goods. The rush of success and easy money was intoxicating. He wanted more. The neighborhood began to change. Thomas realized that fear and intimidation could be monetized. He started demanding protection money from younger students, threatening social destruction if they didn't comply. His network expanded, bringing in other disturbed teenagers who saw opportunity in his ruthless approach. At this point, Thomas had developed a complex web of manipulation. He was a calculated predator who understood exactly how to exploit social vulnerabilities. His targets were carefully chosen, those least likely to fight back or report him. He chose the weak. One day, he decided that his target would be the blind man from across the street. There was no one weaker than a blind man who couldn't see that he was being robbed. Mr. Harrison, a 65-year-old retired music teacher from East Africa, who lived alone on the edge of the neighborhood. Thomas picked him because he felt Mr. Harrison wouldn't report a crime he did not see. Harrison was known for walking with a white cane. He always carrying an expensive leather messenger bag that Thomas had observed contained valuable items. One quiet afternoon, Thomas followed Mr. Harrison home. The old man walked slowly, carefully tapping his way along the sidewalk. Thomas's previous calculated thefts had desensitized him to the human cost of his actions. This wouldn't be just another theft. It would be a calculated invasion of personal space and trust. Thomas began his carefully planned approach. He had observed Mr. Harrison's routine that morning. He studied the slow, methodical walk, the way he tapped his white cane against the sidewalk, the familiar leather messenger bag slung across his shoulder. He was sure that the bag would be his soon. Thomas knew timing was everything. He waited until Mr. Harrison was about halfway between the main street and his small bungalow. It was a stretch with fewer houses and fewer potential witnesses. The street was lined with old oak trees, casting long shadows in the late afternoon light. As he approached, Thomas adjusted his walk to match Mr. Harrison's pace. He knew from his observations that the blind man was partially deaf as well, which would make his approach easier. "Excuse me, sir," Thomas called out softly, deliberately making his voice sound helpful. "Do you need any assistance crossing?" Mr. Harrison stopped, turning slightly. "Oh, that's kind of you. I'm quite close to home, but thank you." Thomas moved closer, his hand already calculating the trajectory to the messenger bag. He noticed the leather was more expensive than he thought, likely custom-made. Who was this man anyways? Could he be richer than he was letting on? Or was this a gift from a former student? The bag looked like it contained more than just a few casual items. Unfortunately, Thomas didn't do his background check well. What Thomas didn't know was that Mr. Harrison wasn't alone. He had large German Shepherd, a new trained guide dog named Mozart. Mr. Harrison and the dog had created a fast bond. Mozart was a smart dog who was quietly observing the entire interaction. Thomas's hand was already inching toward the messenger bag when Mozart suddenly growled, a low, menacing sound that cut through the quiet street. Mr. Harrison stiffened. "Mozart, what's wrong?" The guide dog positioned himself between Thomas and Mr. Harrison, blocking the path. Thomas realized his carefully planned approach was unraveling. He tried to maintain his helpful facade. "Is everything okay, sir?" Thomas asked, taking a step back. But Mozart wasn't fooled. The dog's ears were pinned back, his body tense and ready to spring. Mr. Harrison, sensing something was wrong, gripped his cane more tightly. "Who's there?" Mr. Harrison asked, his voice suddenly sharp. Mozart seems quite agitated. Thomas knew he had seconds to make a decision. The dog was clearly not going to let him get close. Years of bullying and theft had made him adaptable, but this was a scenario he hadn't anticipated. Thomas took a careful step back, but Mozart's growl intensified. "Mozart, what's happening?" Mr. Harrison asked, his hand reaching out to touch the dog's collar. The German shepherd let out a sharp bark that echoed down the quiet street. Thomas knew he needed to retreat, but something in his predatory nature made him hesitate. He'd never been successfully stopped before. Mozart suddenly lunged forward, not touching Mr. Harrison, but positioning himself in a clear defensive stance. His body was a perfect shield, muscles coiled, ready to attack. "Sir," Thomas tried, attempting to sound concerned, "maybe I should call someone for you." Mr. Harrison's hand moved to his phone. "Mozart, track," he commanded softly. As Thomas began to slowly back away, Mozart gave a single, precise bark, a sound that seemed to say, "I see you." Thomas was terrified, but he was maddened by his own mission. He needed to be successful at stealing this bag. He wasn't going to let a simple guide dog stop him. Very quickly and without thinking, he managed a quick snatch of the messenger bag. Mr. Harrison called out, "Hey!" But Thomas was already sprinting. Mozart's response was instantaneous. The moment Thomas ran, the German shepherd transformed from a calm guide dog into a relentless predator. Mr. Harrison shouted, "Mozart, track!" swinging his tail, and the dog launched into pursuit. Thomas trusted in his own instincts and knowledge of the street. As long as he had the bag, escaping was easy. He darted through backyards, vaulted fences, zigzagged through narrow alleys. But Mozart moved with a calculated precision that was terrifying. Every time Thomas thought he'd lost the dog, he'd hear those precise, rhythmic footsteps tracking him. Soon Thomas realized that this wasn't just a chase, this was a hunt. The bag's weight slowed Thomas. Mozart gained ground with each block. Thomas could hear the dog's controlled breathing, could sense the methodical pursuit that showed no signs of tiring. "Leave me alone," Thomas shouted. He was panicking. Mozart just kept tracking. Thomas's heart raced as he clutched the stolen messenger bag. Each breath came in ragged gasps, his previous confidence dissolving into pure terror. Mozart's pursuit was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. He was a relentless, calculated tracking that seemed almost supernatural dog. The first few blocks were a blur of desperate turns. Thomas darted through a narrow alleyway between two convenience stores, knocking over trash cans in his wake. The crash of metal echoed, but Mozart's footsteps never wavered. The dog moved with a precision that suggested years of advanced training. Through residential streets, across vacant lots, Mozart tracked Thomas with an unwavering determination. The dog wasn't just following a scent. He was cutting off escape routes, herding Thomas like prey. Thomas would duck behind a dumpster, press himself against a wall, hold his breath. But within moments, Mozart would appear. Not barking, not growling, just present. A silent, terrifying presence that seemed to know exactly where Thomas would move next. "What do you want?" Thomas screamed, his voice cracking with fear. Mozart's response was silence, just those steady, rhythmic footsteps. The bag felt heavy now. Thomas opened it briefly while running, discovering it contained more than he'd expected. Sheet music, a leather-bound notebook, what looked like expensive classical recordings. He was pissed at the content of the bag. There was no cash or something he could easily spend without pawning or reselling. But he had come all this way. He would need to profit from it now. He deserved it. It was almost like Mozart read Thomas's thoughts because it started barking at him again, and they resumed the chase. As the chase continued, Thomas's life flashed before his eyes. He began to feel like he might not make it out of the situation without getting hurt. He felt bullied by the dog. He began to reminisce on everything he had done. Every bullying moment, every stolen item, every person he'd intimidated, they were all converging in this moment. He began to wish that the chase was just a very bad dream that he would wake up from. Each time Thomas thought he'd found a clever escape, the dog would appear from an unexpected angle. It was as if Mozart could predict his movements, read his desperate thoughts. Through parks, across busy streets, down residential blocks, Mozart tracked Thomas relentlessly. Thomas's body build, which had always been an advantage in bullying, now worked against him. The bag and his growing exhaustion slowed him. Mozart, by contrast, seemed to draw energy from the pursuit. The dog was more focused, more determined. As evening approached, Thomas was no longer running with purpose. He was running from pure terror. His earlier bravado, the calculated bullying, the thefts, the social manipulations, all of it stripped away, revealing a vulnerable core he'd spent years hiding. "Please!" Thomas finally screamed, tears mixing with sweat. "Just leave me alone." Thomas was tired. He threw the bag at the angry, growling dog. Mozart's response was unchanged. He left the bag behind and kept chasing Thomas with steady, calculated footsteps. The pursuit lasted hours. Thomas went from confident thief to a broken, terrified individual. Every escape route closed. Every moment of hope crushed by the methodical tracking of a dog who seemed to embody pure, focused justice. Exhausted and completely broken, Thomas finally collapsed on a street corner. Mozart stood a few feet away, watching with unwavering intensity. The dog hadn't touched him, but the psychological pursuit had been more devastating than any physical attack. Mr. Harrison had been waiting, guided by local residents who had witnessed the extraordinary chase. "Mozart, hold," he commanded softly. Thomas looked up, terror and desperation in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he stammered. "I'm so sorry. I'll return the bag. I promise." Mr. Harrison's voice was calm, almost philosophical. "You can bring it back to me, but Mozart will accompany you every step of the way." "No, I will bring it back. He doesn't have to follow me. I just want that dog far away from me." "That dog is going with you. I can't trust that you would come back with my bag." "Okay, no problem." The blind man's words carried a weight that transcended the immediate situation. This wasn't just about a stolen bag. It was about consequence, about understanding the impact of one's actions. Thomas nodded frantically. "Yes, sir. I'll bring it back exactly as I found it." Mozart walked directly behind Thomas, close enough to touch but never quite making contact. The dog was a constant, silent reminder of the chase, of the boundaries Thomas had violated. After a few minutes of waiting, Thomas and the dog emerged from one of the alleys. Thomas handed over the bag with trembling hands. Mr. Harrison carefully checked its contents. The sheet music, the notebook, the classical recordings were untouched. "Go home," Mr. Harrison said quietly, "and think about why you chose to steal from someone who cannot see you coming." Mozart sat beside his owner, those intelligent eyes still fixed on Thomas as a final, unspoken warning. As Thomas walked away, he knew something fundamental had changed. He felt nothing but humiliation and regrets. He felt powerless. The bully who believed he could manipulate and steal without consequence had been stripped bare by a dog's relentless pursuit of justice. He had definitely learned that bullying and theft were not signs of strength, but manifestations of deep personal insecurity. Raised in a challenging environment of emotional neglect and aggression, he learned to control others as a way of masking his own sense of powerlessness. True strength is not about intimidating others, but about building genuine connections and showing compassion. Thanks for watching. Make sure to hit the subscribe button so you never miss out on new and exciting stories. Share this video with your friends as well, and we'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Lastly, remember to check the other videos on the channel. Every story is worthy of your attention.